Empiricism, George Berkeley. History and Systems of Psychology, Professor Michael Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. George Berkeley was an Irish bishop who was a very religious man. He came up with what typically comes across in this class as one of the more unusual ideas about empiricism and how we use sensory information. I always go back and forth between thinking Berkeley had some really cool ideas and Berkeley's kind of a space cadet. So as you go through, I want you to make up your own mind and determine what you think of Berkeley's empiricism. So let's look at Berkeley's basic ideas. Now, being a very religious man, he was worried that materialism, or this notion that many other people, including Hobbes, had, that all matter simply was running into each other, was causing things to happen, would lead to a purely mechanical description of the universe and humans' behavior in it, and ultimately wouldn't need God. Now, this is something that Berkeley, as a religious guy, couldn't tolerate. So his foundations of his philosophy are driven by being very anti-materialistic. In fact, you'll see he's about as anti-materialistic as you can possibly be. His starting point for his philosophy is the denial of the existence of matter. Now, he really believed that things existed and matter existed, but how it gets to us and how we understand it is another game. And a lot of this is, I believe, an intellectual exercise here. So, one of the things, and we'll come back to these notions again, is that he only believed in secondary qualities. He thought everything was a secondary quality, and that our perceptions of primary qualities made them in turn secondary qualities. Now, he believed, as a great religious leader, that what we experience through our senses essentially are God's ideas, and that we can come to an understanding of God by knowing his ideas. But let's look at his ideas on perception and how we perceive matter before we go further with his ideas. So for Berkeley, as we've already said, there are only secondary qualities. We don't experience a primary quality, we experience a secondary quality, even of those primary ones. And just to remind you, he's not a materialist. He's strongly opposed to it. Now, why is he an empiricist? Because he believes that all knowledge is a function of sensation or perception. But let's take this a little bit further. He believes that all things come into existence when they are perceived. Now, this causes a lot of potential issues that I'm sure you're thinking about right now. But hang on, Berkeley has a way of addressing them. And one of the first notions is that to us, our reality is simply our perceptions. And I think this is probably a fairly modern cognitive view of how the mind works. We never experience the things themselves. We only experience our perceptions of them through the senses. So when we perceive something, it exists. So I'm sitting in my office right now at home, and to me, everything around me at this point exists. But can I really trust that outside of my office door, there is a reality that still exists? You've probably all heard the old saying, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody's around to see it fall, did it really make any noise? Kind of similar to Berkeley's notions of things. He believed that everything is perceived, and if we're not perceiving things, then he places God as what he calls the permanent perceiver. So that tree that's falling in the middle of the woods in Siberia does indeed exist, does indeed make a noise when it falls, because God is perceiving it. In Berkeley's view, God is providing external reality through this perception of the world. Well, how do we get these sensations? He has several ideas about associationism. And Berkeley believed that each sense modality received different information about an object. So for any particular object, it's got a taste, it's got a smell, a feel, how you see it, the tactile nature of touching it. I'm sure I'm missing one of the five senses, but you get the point. Through experience with objects, we associate sensations with an object, and then we can understand it. He believes we contiguously experience the five sense modalities simultaneously. So, if I were to pick up my coffee cup, now my coffee cup's got some primary qualities, but I perceive the weight, I perceive the shape. I'm not going to taste the mug, but I'll take a sip of the coffee. And that coffee has a certain taste to it, I've experienced. It has a smell. It tactily lands on my taste buds. So we experience all five senses at the same time. So this is how we make our associations. So we name objects based on the aggregation or the putting together of the information across the five senses. Now, this leads to an interesting notion with Berkeley. Berkeley believed that all complex perceptions were simply compounds of elementary sensations. In other words, he was a reductionist. You could take apart any complex sensation, like the taste of coffee, and break it down into its constituent parts. So with Berkeley, we have this main notion that to be is to be perceived. He goes forth and says that our knowledge of reality is simply our knowledge of our sensations. Well, in a second, I'll cease to be perceived by you, so you'll have to wonder whether I exist. But you'll find out that I do by watching the next installment of The History of Psychology. See you then. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020, Professor Michael Botwin. All rights reserved.